Well, first of all, Ron Ness and Lynn Helms contacted me in June of 2020 about the CARES Act money that Governor Burgum had designated to plug and abandon orphan wells. And they wanted me to come and meet with them, see if I wanted to take that project on, and I wasn't really sure right away. I kind of felt like I'd been conned by a couple of used car salesmen, but after thinking about it, I decided to do it. So I met with Lynn, Ron Ness, Kathy NESET, and Daryl Anderson from HAMS. So we kind of set the standards and the guidelines for the program. One thing, most many of these wells that had been drilled prior to NDIC even requiring a permit or a bond for these wells, so it saved the state and taxpayers a lot of money with this CARES Act money we got to use to plug these wells. And some of the criteria they wanted was they wanted all the vendors for the P&A project to be North Dakota-based companies. And this would help keep the employees and the employers afloat and fund the companies through the COVID shutdown. We had to make a few exceptions. Cementing was a shortage, plus coiled tubing, but other than that, every company we used had their home base in the state of North Dakota. After that, we selected 3 consulting firms: NESET Consulting, North Plains, and Petroleum Experience were picked to lead the P&A operations. We had meetings in Bismarck and local meetings and got an agenda and a P&A process put together. We agreed each firm would have 4 consultants out at a time, which that would be 12 workover rigs going at one time, and that was probably really pushing it for the state, because the state had other issues and jobs for their field supervisors, which we had to have present when we were doing the logging and perforating and cementing. So it was a tight schedule for everybody. But little did we know the huge impact this would have on all the business around, not just service companies, but the secondary people: motels, hotels, cafes, gas stations, convenience stores, probably a few bars, but our startup date was August 20th, and it ended December 31st, but we actually shut down just before Christmas, so we didn't have a lot of time. But one of the biggest issues getting started was the one calls. You know, every time you dig, you have to have a one call. Well, when you have 12 different companies going out to do a one call, and every time you're going to do a one call for each thing different thing you're going to do, well, I finally got an agreement with the one call that we could use one ticket, and everybody could piggyback on that ticket as long as it was done within 30 days. So that really saved a lot of time. Then we had to have scouts go out and inspect the locations and contact all the landowners to let them know what we were going to do. And then we had to install deadmen and test them. Line up service rig companies. We picked 10 companies that were locally owned that we could use. Coil tubing companies, water trucks, hot oil trucks, transportation trucks, hot shot, winch trucks, cranes, everything we needed to get the job done. Blowout preventers. We needed to locate some yards to store pumping units, rods and tubing. Once we got going, we had all this rods and tubing stored. Toward the end of the project, we sold all the rods and tubing to local ranchers and farmers at a pretty good rate. I mean, for them, we didn't do it to make money on it, but they were pretty happy, and I still get calls wanting more. We had to have test tanks for the fluids. disposal site for the fluids. We'd have other disposal sites and waste sites for contaminated fluid and soils. That was a big issue. Some norm in the tanks, we had a company that could handle that for us. We had, another issue we had was companies with downhole tools, packers, bridge plugs and retainers. When we told them the capacity and the volume we needed, they didn't believe us. You know, they said there's no way we could use that much stuff. But we finally got them on board, so we had enough rods and retainers and bridge plugs, so we didn't have to shut down waiting on anything. Because you might be setting 2, 3 of them on a well a day, and you got 12 wells going. There was a lot of equipment. Wireline trucks, we needed them to log, perforate, set bridge plugs and retainers. Some of the wells we need to have H2S equipment on. Hydrotesters. A lot of this tubing is so junky. With each of the firms finally got enough tubing tested so they had work strings, so they just carried with them to the next location because it was, you know, some of it had holes the size of your fist, and we even had some wells when we rigged up on the wellhead just broke right off them, so we had to get welders in, weld a stub on them so we could get a BOP on them to work on them. We had to have roustabout crews, payloaders to move rods and tubing, pumping units off the wells, mowers, cut some of the grass. Some of these wells, the weeds and everything is high. We had to get them cut before we dared to move on because of fires. And we had to have welders to cap the wells when we're done. And that pretty much covered our P&A. And then our reclamation side, we had to have soil specialists, we'd have soil testing, drone imaging, dirt contractors. That took about 28 people per well for the reclamation. And the other project we had was the Alteris pipeline. That was over by Benny Pierre Road. It's 50 miles of pipeline. We had to take and go in and find all the risers and all the fingers off the pipelines. We had to purge all of them, push all the fluids back into the main line and get a chlorides down so it's fresh water. Then we capped those fingers off, and then when we're done, then we purged the whole main line, got all the fluid out. And NESET consultant was in charge of that. Well, we hired 2 guys, Tom Schumacher and Glenn Wallen. They were retired NDIC guys, worked for the commission. And so it really worked good because they knew so many of the ins and outs that nobody else was really aware of, and it worked very well with the Industrial Commission because they knew how to get everything done. They didn't figure we would get that done last fall, but we come in about $1 million under what the projected cost of that was going to be. And for all this stuff, all our vendors had to sign an MSA that was between the consulting firms and NDIC had approved the MSAs. And then all the vendors were paid within 2 weeks after each phase of the well to keep their money from the project, to keep them afloat rather than have to take their own money out. And a big thanks to Governor Burgum and Lynn Helms for putting this project together and saving thousands of jobs. And I'll let Gene Datahan continue. Sure.
Do you have any idea, like, of total percentage of workover rigs working at that time, what this work was in terms of percentage?
Well, I believe, I'm not sure in that, but I can tell you that each one of these wells result in about 768 different people employed per well with different jobs, and 12 wells being plugged at the same time. That's on, 768 was on the 12 rigs. And then it's about 64 people per well that had different jobs. So it was a huge project. I think they figured what the direct and indirect impact was about 37,000 people involved in this with by the time you're, all your outside stuff, so.
We'd like to show you a video that I Ain't Jack Productions created and produced on behalf of NESET Consulting and the NDIC website.
In 2020 was a challenging year for us. It actually started out in January and February, fairly good months. Well, then March hit, and the pandemic caused the oil price to collapse. And then we basically were at a standstill.
It was devastating, and to a level that we have never seen before. What did companies do? Well, we saw immediately as they started pulling everything in. They dropped the drilling rigs. We came to about March 8th of 2020. Saudi Arabia and Russia began their price war about curtailing production. It just absolutely decimated this industry, the oil and gas industry.
When March hits and you come to a screaming halt, it's sleepless nights, wondering what you're going to do next and how long is it going to last.
What happened is a lot of people lost their jobs. Good, solid, long-term workforce was put out of business.
The whole world was affected by it, so obviously there were also no jobs and, people getting laid off. And I wasn't sure if I was going to be working.
Eventually, the CARES Act money comes, and our Governor Burgum, working with state officials, decided one of the allocations of that money would be to the North Dakota Industrial Commission and our director, DMR Director Lynn Helms, to take care of a long-standing problem, and that is capping and a permanent abandon to wells that have been abandoned out in the field.
I was in control of the whole project, so I had to hire all the services, starting from the workover rigs, cement companies, roustabouts, water trucks, anything to do with plugging the wells.
We had 3 to 4 rigs going, being that it was such a tight deadline that, we really had to make sure everything was going efficiently. If I had one guy in Burke County, I had to make sure that all the wells he was going to stays in Burke County, because there's no point having all these rigs travel back and forth.
One of the criteria they wanted set up was that we had to use all North Dakota companies that had a home base in North Dakota. Wanted to make sure this money recirculated in North Dakota, so if this thing came back, they had people to work. That was the big thing with this CARES Act money. We wanted to save the services, save this experience. It kept that experience in the state instead of letting these guys leave because they didn't have a job. Oil has kind of come back. Now we've got experienced people still working on these wells instead of having to retrain people, and the cost of retraining these people is astronomical.
That's a lot of invoices, processing that and approving, making sure that that is exactly what we did, and then a fast turnaround, sending that to the state so then we can pay these vendors right away, because that was one of the goal here is to keep these North Dakota businesses in business.
It was perfect timing to have something like this that took care of a problem for the state, put a lot of good people to work, and keep them around for when the industry got back on its feet.
The roustabouts, hauler rods, and tubing, we sold it to all the landowners. I sold all the pumping units to one company. And then when it was done, we issued a check to the state for over $250,000.
Fast forward to 2021, oil prices rebounded. There's some optimism in the industry. Companies are starting to put wells back online. Projects are starting up again. So thanks to the P&A project, we were able to keep 100% of our staff on. It helped everyone a lot and took away the sleepless nights. It was the best project I've been involved in, for sure.
We ended up plugging 280 wells. We reclaimed 143 wells, plus 640 acres of land we put back into production. We reclaimed a 50-mile abandoned pipeline, saved about $1 million on costs.
Really good job at explaining the situation that we're all in, you know, being that the COVID-19 pandemic eventually hits the U.S. and the prices, oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia really starts to intensify. And so our U.S. oil prices fell and essentially collapsed the oil industry here in North Dakota. And a lot of people are in the same situation where you either lost your job or you're unsure that you're going to have one tomorrow. And I can relate to that. I wasn't sure I was going to keep my job. And working down here with a visa, there was a possibility that would be revoked. And so a few statistics here. According to the state, back in last year of March, 6,200 wells were shut in. That entails 450,000 barrels of production shut in. At this time, there were 11 drilling rigs operating, one frac crew, almost 800 wells were abandoned, and thousands of unemployment claims were filed, and of course, the gas plants were also affected. And so something had to be done, and on March 25th, the U.S. Senate passed the $2 trillion Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which is where the acronym CARES Act comes from, essentially to help stabilize our workers, families, and the economy during this pandemic. And one of the many problems that arises during an economic downturn is that these operators and well owners really start to get in trouble financially to a point where they can no longer operate the wells, and the wells get abandoned, and then to a more extreme point gets orphaned. And the difference between an orphaned well and an abandoned well is that an abandoned well has a liable operator, it just hasn't been producing or injecting for over 12 months, whereas an orphaned well does not have a liable operator who is financially and legally responsible to deal with the well. Now, thankfully, North Dakota has 0 orphaned wells, but 549 abandoned wells could have been orphaned due to the pandemic. And so our Governor Burgum worked with state officials and decided that one of the allocations of the CARES Act funding would be towards the NDIC Oil and Gas Division to plug and reclaim these abandoned wells. And so this was essentially the creation of the Dokken Restart Task Force Action Plan, and within this action plan there were multiple focus areas, not just the P&A, but in terms of allocations of funding, $33 million was approved for plugging work and $33.2 million was approved for reclamation work. During the preliminary stages of the program, 368 abandoned wells were reviewed for as candidates for the program. Now, earlier Larry explained to you kind of the operational stages of the project, the scope of it, where he was contacted by Lynn Helms to overall senior project manage the whole program, whereas I project coordinated NESET's operational involvement of it. As Larry said, official startup was August 2020, and then a tight deadline of December 31st, 2020. Now, the program can be divided into 2 phases, phase 1, well plugging, and phase 2, surface reclamation. Well plugging is the process of isolating specific intervals of the well bore to prevent communication of fluids by means of a mechanical plug or multiple cement plugs. To simplify the process, it can be divided into 4 steps. Number 1 being a workover rig is utilized to remove all your tubulars, downhole equipment such as your rod, tubings, and your bottom hole assembly. And once all of that is removed downhole, then you can pump all your cement or mechanical plugs at specific intervals. These specific intervals are your completed zones, your flow potential zones, surface casing shoe, and then your uppermost plug, which is your surface plug. This is just one scenario, just one example. You can have as many as 7 plugs or 3 plugs, and it really depends on your wellbore conditions, wellbore design, and formations penetrated, and many more other factors. So after you've plugged the well, you cut your casing 4 feet below your surface level, and after that, a steel cap is welded on top of the cut casing. Within this phases, Larry worked out the numbers and really thought of who was involved and what job types were involved from start to finish of plugging a well. And it came out to be 23 job types were involved, and that is 64 individuals per well, just plugging one well. So that's a lot of people involved already. Then on phase 2, surface reclamation, which is just a process of returning your land into its original state or closest to its surrounding environment. As you can see on this photo right here, this is a photo of an abandoned well site that one of our field consultants took for us. You can see, something like this hasn't been really producing over 2 or 3 years, how detrimental it can be to our local farmers. And again, to simplify the process, it can be divided into 6 steps. Your flow lines has to be flushed and capped. All your surface equipment has to be removed. Any contaminated soil or equipment has to be hauled off and disposed of properly. And then you have to recontour your site, distribute your topsoil evenly, spread it out, and of course, revegetate your area with native species unless otherwise requested by your surface owners or landowners. And again, within this process, 11 job types were involved and 35 individuals per well site was involved. And adding all that together, that's 99 total North Dakota workers involved in plugging one well. And to me, that's a highlight on its own, but we can talk more about highlights and results here. So these results were collected after the deadline of December 31st. One being, like you saw in the video, 280 wells were plugged across North Dakota. This is just a glimpse of the wells that were plugged. This map specifically shows consistently of wells that NESET Consulting plugged. We plugged wells all over Williams County, Burke County, Botanook County. So these are the really old wells that were drilled, 1950s and 60s and all that. Very, very shallow wells, old wells. So next being 143 abandoned well sites were reclaimed. Now I understand that that doesn't match up how many wells were plugged, and that's because it takes a lot longer to reclaim your land. You can plug your well 3 to 5 days in a good week, but it can take up to 15 days to reclaim a land or longer. But nevertheless, 640 acres were reclaimed, and you can see the before and after photo shown here on the screen, how difference it makes to our local farmers. In addition to that, the Alturas water gathering system was reclaimed, and within that entails 50 miles, approximately 50 miles of poly pipeline, and with that, 39 above ground risers, 18 above ground facilities, and 3 known contaminated areas were reclaimed within that process. And so this alone was a highly significant project. It really involved a lot of highly skilled, very, very experienced workers on its own. So this alone involved a lot of jobs. According to conservative estimates of the state, combining the 3 highlights I just showed you, 37,000 jobs was involved, and this were primarily from services directly related to the operations, so your wireline company, roustabouts, workover rigs, cementing, you name it. But like Larry mentioned, we can't, however, forget about our secondary services. These are your bars, your gas stations, your convenience stores. It really made an impact on the smaller towns around North Dakota, like Lignite, West Hope, Mohall, and those are just a few examples, who really depend on the activity of the oil and gas industry. And so that was a pretty significant impact, I would say. Additionally, all of the salvage surface equipment, like your pumping units, and your pump houses, as well as downhole equipment like your rods and tubing, we were able to sell that to local vendors and local farmers. I mean, you can't believe how many calls Larry and I received from farmers wanting to buy rods and tubing, and you probably know what for. But you can see on this yard right here, just lines and lines of dismantled pumping units and pump houses. And again, we were able to issue that check back to the state so we can save some money for the project. Moving on to what I like to call the muscles of the program, although Larry probably prefers I call him the muscles of the program. The names you see on the screen here is just a small percentage of the vendors that was utilized. It averaged out to be at least 20 vendors that was utilized in both in phase 1 and phase 2, and so there were a lot of invoices involved. I mean, there really had to be a fast-paced, organized process in place on everybody's part, because one of the criteria, again, was to get these vendors paid fast enough where they can use CARES Act funding to cover their expenses. So really, really fabulous job on the NDIC as well. I mean, they would have at least received 400 invoices, and for them to process that fast enough, we were able to distribute the payments to our vendors. One of the vendors that was used, this photo was gifted to us from Hamswell Services. They were able to keep 100% of their staff. And you can see just by this picture how much of an impact it made to just one vendor, yet alone all of the other vendors that was involved in the P&A program. And we actually received letters from a few of these participants. They shared their stories and expressed their gratitude, and we simply don't have time to go over these letters individually, but feel free to come visit us at our NESET booth, and I'd love to share these letters with you, and we can go through them together. And with that, I'd like to end this presentation by saying thank you to our North Dakota leaders and Governor Bargum, Lynn Helms, Director of Mineral Resources, and Ron Ness, Petroleum Council President. Without their leadership, we wouldn't have this program at all last year, and it was a really good project that I was involved in, I would say, and